ladies and gentlemen. Today's motion is that this House believes developing nations should nationalize their energy resources. And as a proposition, we strongly believe that developing nations should most definitely nationalize their energy resources. And before moving on into our debate, I'd first like to define a couple of key terms in this motion. We define this House as developing nations, and we define developing nations as a country with low standards of living, generally indicated by severe poverty, low income and education levels, high birth rate, and poorly developed social, economic, and technological infrastructure. And this is according to PBS. And also, we like to define nationalize, to place a joint venture under the public ownership and private ownership. And we're defining this way because there's a rising trend for nations to actually nationalize through joint venture. And also, we like to define energy resources as raw materials used as fuel, such as petroleum, natural gas, and coal. So, we'll also like to set the criteria for both opposition and a proposition. The opposition must prove to us that there are greater harms than benefits when governments nationalize their energy resources. And we as a proposition will prove that nationalization has greater benefits than costs. So, moving on to our stance. Developing nation countries need the opportunity to become more economically and politically independent. The nationalization of energy resources is the answer and opportunity that these nations should grab. We believe that it is too unrealistic to immediately nationalize an entire country's energy resources within one purchase. Therefore, rather, the government should nationalize gradually so that at the end, the outcome, the end product is complete nationalization of these nations' energy resources. And also, government should place its nationalization on its rate of development, as sudden change can bring an economic backlash on the country itself. So we're here to promote the eventual nationalization, ladies and gentlemen. We're here to promote the eventual gradual nationalization of energy resources through measures as we have mentioned, such as joint venture. And we believe this should be done because if nations are able to nationalize, they will see benefits that we'll outline in our case. And we have 3 strong points for you today. And our first point is that nationalization is better financially for the government of developing nations. And our second point is that nationalization would actually reduce the dependence on these big foreign companies by the developing nations. And our third point, which will be elaborated by our excellent second speaker, is that when governments nationalize, they have much more to say regarding both their energy resources and international politics. And moving on to our first case, there are obvious benefits for nations that build their own economy based on their own resources. Let's take Dubai for example. Although they do not have great oil reserves like other Middle East countries, they also have been developing amazingly fast in recent years after their nationalization. Thanks to forward-looking and vigilant government officials and planners. No, thank you. Planners, Dubai has developed into a paramount trading platform and tourist destination of the Middle East. And this is because of nationalization. And also, from 1990 to 2004, Dubai's gross domestic product quadrupled to 27 billion, according to Dubai's Department of Economic Development. And this is because these nations are able to nationalize. And we also see that nationalization can actually prevent exploitation of nations by companies, and which can actually cause an unfair share of profit by the foreign companies. So when the government nationalizes their energy resources, the governments of the developing nations, rather than the companies, can actually rake in profits from selling oil, and in some cases domestically, selling oil abroad, and in some cases domestically. Governments are also able to achieve profit from the natural resources, the black gold or oil that their country holds. When countries' national resources are controlled entirely by private companies, governments do not receive the profit they should. An example is Bolivia. For example, before the nationalization, Bolivia received only 18% of the profits made by its domestic energy resources. Although the Bolivians invested about 3 billion, a big amount of money, to its national resources development, foreign investors received 82% of the country's vast gas reserves. And this was clearly unfair because although they have invested a lot, they're not getting as much back. And so these Bolivians wondered, how come they're not getting fair share amount of money? Why aren't they getting enough money? Why is there unfair share of profit? Because nationalization did not happen. And after the Bolivia actually nationalized their energy resources, they have actually seen great boost in economy. Bolivia's income from energy resources increased from merely 200 million to 1.6 billion in just 5 years after the nationalization. So such example shows that not only does nationalization prevent exploitations, it can actually boost the economy of the country. Also, we also see that by nationalizing energy resources, there is oil price drop for citizens of these developing nations. Because these governments that because these nations that nationalize have power over the prices, they can actually reduce the price so that their citizens can afford cheaper oils. And cutting costs cutting price trickles down to all citizens who buy oil, leading to a more equitable distribution of profits. And this can actually guarantee oil independence in cases such as oil shock of 1970s. And moving on to the second point, which is that they are less dependent by developing nations on these big global companies as a result of nationalization. For nations, as a status quo for nations that did not nationalize, they only get to participate the energy resources through joint ventures, and sometimes not even through these measures. By joint venture and gradual complete nationalization, which we have been promoting the whole time, the nations can actually vocalize how the energy is being handled in the country. And for example, we have also provided example of oil price drop.
Sir,
Yes.
could you please describe at least 2 examples of how the companies actually abused their power and raised the price for so that the nations were unable to get the oil resources?
At this point, because of time constraint, I'll only mention one example. But we have also, and this example is Bolivia. And Bolivia, although they invested $3 billion out of its budget to its national resources development, they only received 18%. Why 18%? Why 18% out of 100%? It's because these companies have been exploiting these countries by unfairly distributing their profits. And moving on, and concerning the second point, also companies used to hold in their hands. Also, these companies can actually exploit these developing nations, and if that is the case, these developing nations, by nationalization, they can actually kick out these companies if they violate human rights or these profit problems. So this second point about reducing dependence actually ties back to our first point about how nations can therefore prevent blatant exploitations by foreign companies. Therefore, for these reasons, because nationalization is actually boosting the economy of these nations, and 2, because this actually nationalization reduces the dependence of by developing nations on these big global companies. We strongly believe that developing nations should most definitely nationalize their energy resources. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, we agree with the government side about the general definitions of the motion. However, the government side has many misleading flaws in their argument, and I would like to start with the rebuttals for the arguments given by the government. First, the government side has stated that nationalizing natural resources will bring greater benefits for greater financial benefits for the developing nations. However, for example, Saudi Arabia, they had nationalized their natural resources, but because they lacked the basic infrastructure for the economy, they could not stand alone and retain the same economic status when the 4 American oil companies were in their country helping them to develop the natural resources they had. No, thank you. And also, it actually caused more burden for the government because the Saudi Arabian government, they did not have enough indigenous workers who were trained like the American workers of the American oil company to actually produce the same amount of natural resources they could produce when the company was in place. Also, the government side mentioned about Dubai. Dubai has, of course, had some improvement in their economy. However, this is actually due to tourism, not solely based on the nationalization of natural resources, and thus this is irrelevant. And also, the government side has actually failed to deal with the corruption that could be in the government. When the government take the natural resources, no, thank you. from the private companies, they actually could be corrupt and would actually be abusing. And when the opposition had asked for any example of any countries abusing these rights for the natural resources, they could not give any, but merely state, no thank you, the name of a country, Bolivia, because there is none. It is actually the government who can abuse the power over the natural resources to raise the price, like Venezuela. And we will now go on to our substantive cases and give out and prove to you that this case, the government's case, falls. First, we believe that in order to protect the spirit of capitalism, individual rights of corporations, and developing nations' need for foreign investment, we should not nationalize their energy resources. To prove our stance that nationalizing resources will infringe on the spirit of capitalism and individual rights of corporations and the developing nations' need for foreign investment, we have three strong arguments. And our first argument is that, no thank you, nationalizing energy resources will lack practicality. And our second argument is that nationalizing energy resources will be detrimental to the society. And our third argument is that it will disrupt the free market. And as the leader of opposition, I will elaborate on our first and second argument, and my deputy leader of opposition will elaborate on our third argument. Now, moving on to our case. Argument number 1. Nationalizing energy resources will lack practicality. There will be government inefficiencies. To prove or to support our argument, we have two sub-arguments. Our first sub-argument, abuse. This nationalizing the natural resources will be abused, causing the control by minority ruling elite of the government. For example, Libya. The Libyan natural resources are controlled by few elites, and this will actually be detrimental to the nation because the government, which is corrupt, will actually be their decisions on the use of natural resources all will be affected by the decisions that the corrupt government makes. Thank you.
How is letting companies control the energy resources any better than letting a government, which at least has the need to provide for its citizens, how is it any better to give this to corporations?
Thank you for an excellent point, because the government side is not understanding the point of the opposition, because although the government is actually the national government, it could be corrupt, which will concentrate on fulfilling their own interests instead of the citizens' interests. No, thank you. And also, to prove our first argument, we have the second sub-argument, where resources may work as a weapon or threat to other nations and create instability in the world. When we're supposed to be going for peace, we will actually make another effective weapon. For example, Venezuela, in February 2008, Venezuela threatened to cut off the oil with the U.S. because of the dispute with ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil won rights to freeze $12 billion of assets of Venezuelan government-owned industry from courts in U.S. and Britain. This just effectively shows how the Venezuelan government could threaten other nations, other foreign nations who rely on their natural resources by saying that they will cut off the natural resources because the government has the rights to control the natural resources. And it will actually be detrimental to not only the nation itself, but to other foreign nations that are dependent on that nation's natural resources.
On that point, ma'am,
Yes?
do you not realize that we define the House as developing nations, and therefore we're deciding on the interests of developing nations?
Thank you for an excellent point. It is not only the U.S. that is dependent on the natural resources of the developing nations. Other developing nations, they also rely on the few natural resources countries who are